podcast. I'm Heath Cole. Today we're going to talk about being offended. I've noticed this trend over the last 15 or so years where being offended has become a way to avoid conflict. Like, it's okay to have free speech, but if I get offended, you're not allowed to speak to me anymore. And I see this with kids a lot. I see it with adults. I see it with employees. There's a tendency to think that being offended somehow trumps everybody else's view of what's going on. And we all are in the same boat, really. We want to be valued, accepted, appreciated, validated, and given a path towards our future that takes into account my individual values, beliefs, strengths, and challenges. That's what kids are after, but if we get into being offended, then we lose the ability to kind of have those conversations because we're just trying to silence other people by saying that we're the victim of them and they're the perpetrator. I grew up at a time when freedom of speech meant that everything that you could imagine saying was considered protected under freedom of speech. And now you have freedom of speech as long as you don't offend somebody. But the minute you offend somebody, then they can say that that's hateful speech or it's somehow a different kind of speech that should be shut down because of its offensive nature. Well, kids are getting the message from the adults in their lives that this is the best way to deal with situations. It's just to say, hey, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm offended. Therefore, I can check out of this conversation. And because I'm offended, I'm noble. And because you're offensive, you're mean, you're hateful, you're all of these things. And so that creates a difficult situation because it's really hard to hold kids accountable if they're going to be offended all the time. Now, there are certain things that are offensive. I mean, personal attacks or untrue statements about people, those are offensive, and it's perfectly understandable to see how people be offended if those things are stated out loud. But just to rush to being offended every time you don't want to deal with some information means that you're giving up on resolution, you're giving up on conflict, you're giving up on really the relationship. And kids have learned that if they give up first, nobody can give up on them. And I don't think we're better off for it. So I have noticed in my work with kids and adults that a lot of times people have kind of unhealthy and destructive tendencies, self-destructive or self-sabotaging behaviors. And when you start addressing them, they just get offended, and then they get to live like peacefully with their own self-sabotaging or self-deprecating behaviors and thought processes. And it's really hard to challenge those if offense is the thing that gets you out of it. So as an adult, I choose to really work very hard not to be offended very often, particularly with kids. And kids will come in and scream and curse at us, and I understand they're in a difficult situation. They're trying to process what's going on in their life. They're frustrated that their parents have made certain choices or that they've had to be accountable for their choices. And so I can understand that. So when they come in and curse and say things, being offended doesn't really help me. It doesn't really further the relationship. So as parents, I'm hopeful that we can really work towards not being as offended and just start working through it. And what I found is when a kid says something offensive, just treating it like information, taking the emotional toll out of it is the best way to approach that. So a kid comes and says, "Oh, I hate you." Okay, tell me why. Give me a good explanation as to why you hate me. Or if they tell me, "Hey, go F you," okay, explain that to me. What did I do to deserve that kind of behavior? And then you work through it. Being offended means you're saying, "Hey, let's just end here." And a lot of kids are programmed that if an adult ends a relationship, they don't have any obligation. They can just move on with their behavior. And so a lot of kids today are actually trying to get people to give up. A lot of kids are trying to get the adults to give up accountability, to give up criticism, to give up guidance, and just let them be however they want to be. And statistically speaking, we're not in a better place because of it. I'm from New Mexico. We're 50th in a lot of categories. We rank number one in two categories. 11-year-olds having children of their own, which is a crazy statistic, and the exposure to childhood trauma, 3 or more childhood traumas for kids in New Mexico. We have one of the highest rates in the country. Those aren't desirable statistics, but when you look at what the defense mechanism is for a lot of kids, it's to be offended. It's just, "Oh, you're offending me, you're hurting my feelings, therefore I can shut down your free speech just because of my offense." And the more we allow that to happen, the harder it gets to hold kids accountable, the harder it gets to get changes in behavior. So a lot of times when kids come to the ranch and they're yeah, I hate you. Okay, cool, thank you. I appreciate that. Let's move on to the next subject. Really, anger is not really that much of a useful tool for adults to use against kids, but you do have the right to be angry. Anger can be dealt with. What can't be dealt with is this idea that being offended absolves you of any responsibility in the relationship, and then you can just walk away. And so many kids today are boxing their parents into this "you offended me" kind of state, and that's really difficult to deal with. If you're going to be offended, if a kid's going to be offended, if the adults are going to be offended, you're basically saying the relationship can't exist because of kind of these offensive things. Well, I choose as a parent to prioritize the relationship, and so I don't get really that offended. My kids aren't super offensive people to begin with, so it's good, but really I don't get offended by a lot of people at work. I don't get offended by the kids I work with because it's really a wasted emotion because it doesn't really serve to further the relationship much. And it also keeps me closed off. If I'm worrying about my hurt feelings, then, what good am I to other people? And so I remember when I was a kid, violence was the issue, and now we have this kind of made-up term, violent speech or hate speech or those kinds of things, which is just a way to say that speech is not okay and this other speech that I like is. And that's, kids are getting the message, but it's really not helpful to the furtherance of kids' understanding of the world or their maturity or any of those kinds of things. So I encourage parents to stop being so easily offended and just learn to have disagreement, to work through it, to state what you have to say about it, but not to just rely on being offended as a reason to say, okay, you're wrong, I'm offended. Because kids are paying attention and they're then using that against us as parents and against their friends and against teachers and everybody else. That somehow being offended is this greatest form of offense that can happen, and therefore if you go through this process and you dare to offend a child, then they no longer have to have a relationship with you, and that's really the wrong message to send. So I encourage everybody, take being offended out of the equation. Say, you know what, if I don't like this, I'm going to say I don't like it, or if I don't agree, I'm going to say I don't agree. But just to be offended means that you're taking a lazy approach to handling accountability and a lazy approach to relationships. So I encourage everybody to kind of take a look at that and to say, you know what, I'm going to choose not to be offended. I'm going to choose to try to help my child see things a little bit differently and to explain where I'm coming from and to help them understand what it is that I see in the situation that's different. But how do you teach a kid to listen to your perspective if you never listen to theirs? I mean, if you listen to a kid and they give you their perspective, it's completely way off base. You can say that. If you at least listen, you don't have to agree. You can listen and then say, well, here's how I see it, and then move forward. But when you start getting offended, then you're saying, okay, you don't get to talk anymore because I am offended. Well, they're going to usually just take that into account, and the next time they're in a difficult situation, just say, oh, you offended me, so therefore the relationship is no longer of value. And that really doesn't help. So I encourage everybody, know when you're offended, but don't overuse the term, don't overuse the expression, and really work to be as little, spend as little time being offended as possible. Your kids will be better off for it, and so will you. If you aren't comfortable with your kid copying you, then you really got to take a look at how you're acting. And the first way that I do this is to say, I'm going to choose not to be offended all the time. I'm going to choose to be able to express like an adult how I feel about things that are said and things that are done in my presence and by my kids, and then work through it. At the end of the day, all our kids really want is us to be willing to work through anything with us. And one day, through maturity and the magical impact of getting older, I promise the relationship will shift, and being offended will be the least of your worries. You can have honest conversations, and everybody can express their opinion without anybody ending the relationship. And really, that's what we should be after. So thank you for joining us on the Raise Them Up podcast. We'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you.